So my name is Zonke. I'm from South Africa. I am a teacher by profession, and my work has been centered around emotional development since my early days in my teaching career and field of education, making sure that education and healing in the communities that we come from, because we come from a very wounded country, yes, because of our history, but also because we haven't had a chance to really sit down and talk about our woundedness as a nation. So my work has been around using education to liberate and facilitate healing in our communities and in the country as a whole.
Fantastic. So, yeah, do you want to tell me a bit about how you got into this work? Because you told me before you started as an English teacher, right? The same path as me.
Yes, yes. I was fortunate enough that I went to a high school called the Leap Science and Math School, which has a model that is centered around emotional development. So as a student, it was very clear to me, having my own journey of healing triggered by the space that I was in, where I was asked, I remember for the first time, I think in grade 9, I was asked the question, how do you feel? And I couldn't answer that. I kept saying, I think. And my teacher kept saying, don't think, feel. And I remember that being such a frustrating time because as a young person growing up in such a broken and wounded community, you learn to numb your feelings. So for the first time, I had to trigger and activate my feelings. And from there on, I never wanted to look back. It was hurtful, it was frustrating, it was painful, but removing that scab on the wound was the beginning of my journey. So I knew for a fact that most kids in my community needed to know that education can be healing, education can be nurturing, and education can be this loving space that young people can be in. So it was from there on that I decided that I wanted to make sure that every other child in my community um, experienced what I was experiencing. And I guess that's how I knew that I wanted to become a teacher. And although I started as an English teacher, I could see how education needed to be at the center of driving this work. And of course, even in the leap space where they had this model, I could also see that it was not easy getting adults who have grown up in a system that never really that were never trained in this work, for an example. So in South Africa, as a teacher, there's no particular course that says, oh, right now you're going to do 12 months of emotional development and healing and how to love your students and how to love them unconditionally and so on. So they enter into the profession thinking, well, I'm just here to teach maths. Anything else that you need me to do, don't ask me to be a social worker or a psychologist. So I could see that even in that leap space, there was that difficulty to do this work. They needed to work on their own selves and activate their own healing journey. And so that's how I then entered into teacher development and making sure that one, teachers that were coming into the profession were being trained. So it was part of the training, and that's how I joined Global Teachers Institute, which was also Leap's baby, to try and train teachers that were coming into the profession and making sure that they were coming in with the training of understanding of how emotional development can function in the school and so on. But secondly, how do we take teachers that are already in the profession and help them transform as well and unlearn some of the work that they've been doing in the past 10 to 15 years in their training careers, and relearn how it is to be a teacher that sees students for who they are, a teacher that loves unconditionally, and not just a teacher that just teaches maths because they can. And so it's been that long journey of starting from an English teacher and quickly navigating and seeing that there's more that I needed to do, rather than just being in class as an English teacher. But how do I use this profession and making sure that I'm driving work that I am passionate about, by work that I know from my own experience has helped me in my own journey.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how when people ask you to feel something and not think something, how hard that can be, right? I think for a lot of people, but especially if you have trauma and woundedness that goes back generations, it's probably the default to switch off or to intellectualize. So yeah, what would you say are, this is a really hard question, I think, to speak on behalf of your whole country, but what would you say are the biggest challenges that South Africa is facing at the moment?
Ooh, it is a big question, but from I'm gonna speak from an education perspective because that's what I know best. um, we have a public schooling system that obviously is struggling in all ways possible, from resources, properly trained teachers, and so on. Sorry. But the biggest thing for me, because I feel those things are easily solved. You can quickly put resources in a school. You can quickly train teachers over 12 months. So those are things that I think can be quickly solved by the education system if our government decided to be a properly working government. However, you walk into an average high school in this country, and you can see the anger that exists in our young people. There's violence. They're stabbing each other. There's teenage pregnancy. So you can see that there's a lot of deep anger that exists even in the young people that are in the school itself. And we don't have an education system or a curriculum that addresses that. So we take young people who come from communities and homes where a child who's 16-year-old has to watch a drunk father come home every day, not on weekends, every day, drunk, swearing at everyone in the family, ending up beating the mother. And we expect that child to sit in a maths class and act as a normal child, as if maths is going to solve whatever's going on in his or her life. So that is the biggest problem I see that is happening. We have a youth that is angry. We have a youth that is wounded, that needs some sort of healing to go through. And we can then use the maths and science and all these tools that we have to trigger that healing. We don't have to leave it behind. But we have to ask ourselves as a nation, what do we prefer? Do we prefer to have better doctors and engineers or better mothers and fathers? Because right now we are stuck with homes that don't have good mothers and fathers. And it's because they didn't have that situation where they were able to talk about themselves and talk about what's going on in their lives. So if you take that from a home perspective and you put it into the community, yes, we're a community and a nation that is angry as well because government is not providing or delivering what they're supposed to be doing. But what do we do with that anger? Yes, we do protests, but we then do protests that would damage our own community. So we burn libraries, we burn schools, and we destroy the very infrastructure that is needed for our children, right? So from the simple understanding of how a broken home can ruin a child, you take it into the community as well, how a broken community can ruin the nation as well, right? And if you look at our past as a country, that's all we know. When we were unhappy about the apartheid system, we would protest, we would burn, we would destroy, right? But 1994, um, after the period of apartheid, we never really sat down and said to ourselves, now that we are through this, how do we move forward? How do we start processing our healing? How do we start communicating better? How do we stop the violence that comes with our anger and so on, so that we are able to be more productive when we are able to when we are expressing our anger. So yes, we protest, but we say to ourselves, we will not burn our schools, we will not burn our libraries, because that's for our children, right? So for me, that I see that as the biggest challenge if in this country, because if we look at where we are going as a country, we can have all these dreams of what we want our country to look like and our continent to look like. But if we are not addressing the real problem, which is the woundedness that exists in our country, anyone who's able to just search gender-based violence stats in South Africa, you will be shocked at how many um, young people or women actually are being raped each day. And these are little kids. It's no longer just adults. You get 14-year-olds that are raping. You get 14-year-old boys that are stabbing. So where does that come from? Why do we act shocked at the stats if we know for a fact there's nothing we are doing to address that? By upskilling teachers and saying we are taking them into another English course or maths course, or teachers should start having master's degrees, that is not going to solve the problem, you know? So for me, that is the biggest challenge that I see in our country, that we've come into a period of where, you know, where there's possibility and there's opportunity in this country, and obviously there's an exciting part in that. But I think systems or programs like the TRC, for an example, the Truth Reconciliation Commission, all they did, I think, was just to scratch the surface. You know, there was deep work that needed to be done there, that maybe should have followed that work that was led by Bishop Tutu in the TRC. So maybe we need to go back to that. But from an education perspective, we need in the classroom children talking to each other, looking at each other, and feeling and saying, I'm angry. I'm angry that I was born into a family of violence. I'm angry that my mother is not as nurturing as I would like her to be. And we look at each other and we say, so what do we do now? As adults, how do we stop failing our young people? And how do we work on our own healing so that we don't keep on letting it out into the young people that we serve?
Well, yeah, so there's this massive collective unprocessed anger, right? And woundedness, as you put it, and where to begin. So in the work you've been doing, have you seen any changes or transformation from when you start bringing in this emotional development or emotional intelligence into the classrooms?
Definitely. First, let me start with the teachers, right? Because as I said, we don't have a teacher training system that automatically says in your first year of teaching we're going to be dealing with self, and we're going to be dealing with, you know, your own journey as a human being, and your own addressing of your own healing and woundedness and so on. We don't have that. So to take a teacher, for an example, who has been teaching for 10 years, and to say to them, you need to start listening to your students, whereas they've believed all this time that they are the authority and they are the ones that are supposed to be talking and the child listens. So I've done most of the work with teachers where I try and have and facilitate these conversations with them. And one that sticks out for me all the time is training that I did in Zambia under Global Teachers Institute, where it was a teachers conference from African schools around the continent. And you know, with most of the African countries, they're very conservative. You know, the teacher is the authority, and children are supposed to listen to the adult and so on. So when you start bringing in this information for them, it's like, are you trying to say now we must be disrespected by the children? You know. So when we started having this conversation, and that group had a lot of male teachers in it as well, so you can imagine, you know, the patriarchy that stands firm in such groups. And I did an exercise, and I said to them, think of a time as a teacher, think of a time when you were a student and a teacher said something to you that was very hurtful, that you still remember till today, and tell that to the person next to you. And the plot twist to that is that that person that you've just told needs to tell your story in first person. So if I'm telling Gwyneth's story, I'm not going to say Gwyneth's teacher. I'm going to say my teacher used to call me this, and this is how it affected me. And I'm telling you, the stories that came out of these male teachers who were sobbing, saying to themselves, you know, I had this teacher who used to tease me about how dark my skin was, and he used to parade me in front of the whole class and have children laugh at me because of how dark my skin was. The women, female teachers would talk about how other female teachers would tease them and make other children make fun of them because of their how their bodies were, just because their bodies were more developed than the other group, than the other girls in the class. And you could see the hurt that still existed in that. And I said to them, clearly this was hurtful to you because you still remember it till today. Now if I were to call your students and ask them the same question, what would your students say about you? And you could see them slouching, thinking, you know, how could I be doing the same thing that I was doing to that was done to me, that I still hold on to till today. So this work is not really about, oh, so today we're going to talk about emotional development and let's do a PowerPoint presentation on that. It's digging deep and saying, what is the most hurtful thing that I need to be looking at? Because I care about these children so much that I don't want them to go through the same thing I went through. So for me, the transformation is taking a group of teachers like that who have believed all along that the way they were taught is the right way forward, and them having that moment where the penny drops and them realizing that something has got to change, and something we have to start doing something different for us to be able to lead our children differently. And so I always treasure such moments because it proves that it can be done and it can be incorporated in the school environment, in the school community. There's nothing that's stopping us from being able to sit around in the staff room as teachers and talking to each other about how we treat the students we serve. And the same way with students, um again with teachers, because when we believe when a child is being disrespectful in class, the best way is to kick them out, kick them out of class, detention, or whatever that is. And I always say to teachers, I must always ask myself as a child, as a teacher, that if there's a child that's acting out in class, showing me some sort of behavior, I must be able to ask myself, what is this child trying to communicate with me? Look beyond the behavior. So yes, she's being disrespectful. Yes, she's being cheeky. I must be able as an adult to step back and say to myself, what is Zonke trying to communicate to me right now? What is this anger trying to say to me right now? Because when I look beyond the behavior is just a symptom, right? The minute I step into Zonke's home, I realize that Zonke lives with a grandmother. The parents are not there. There's probably 5 or 6 of them being raised by their grandmother. So the only time Zonke is able to get attention is when Zonke is being disrespectful in class, because only then does the teacher pay attention to Zonke, is able to look at her in the eye. Even though I'm shouting at her, at least it's some sort of attention. And that's what the child needs, right? So if I'm only able to get to that space if I'm working through my own stuff, right? So if I'm my own wounded self and I'm not looking at my own self, I'm not occupied with my own journey that I need to go through. So only if I'm processing my own stuff am I able to see the students in front of me, and am I able to say, whatever this child is showing me is just a symptom. I need to dig deep and find out what is the real problem so that I can care for this child.
Mm, absolutely. And it strikes me as thinking that is what being an adult really is about, right? But maybe as a global society, we don't process our stuff. And so we just have all these people walking around in adult bodies who are just wounded children who haven't really worked through their stuff. Yeah. So the African Consciousness Center. This is something I also wanted to ask you to tell me a little bit about. I love the name.
Well, that work comes from, I think that work coming together comes from streams of my own journey that has just come together into that body of work. The name African Consciousness first comes from the fact that while I was still a student teacher under the Global Teachers Institute program, they used to have this program where we would travel to the US and would be placed into different schools learning um, about the education system that side, and obviously being mentored by teachers as well. And it was sort of an exchange program. And obviously, as an African stepping into the American society, you would have all sorts of conversations about, me as an African, and them assuming that Africa is one country and so on. And although it used to be irritating that there was so much ignorance around my continent and how they would communicate about my continent, I used to come back from those trips also upset about the fact that even if they weren't being arrogant, the truth of the matter is I still did not know most of the things they were asking me about. when it comes to my continent. So if they were asking me something about Congo or something that happened in Congo, yes, I would think, I must go to know something that happened in Congo. I'm from South Africa, another country. But at the same time, I'd feel, I wish I knew what was happening in Congo. I wish I knew how I can be able to tell stories about my African continent and the real history, so that I can argue back, and clap back and be like, no, this is how things are done in my continent. So it used to bother me a lot that I didn't have that knowledge, and I didn't have um, that rootedness around what my continent is about. And all that I could talk about was slavery and, the colonization that happened and so on. And from that journey, I started this new journey of just discovering and wanting to learn more about my continent. And obviously, as a South African, we, again, from an education perspective, the education system in South Africa does not encourage young people to graduate excited about being African. And I think that is the root. People have all sorts of reasons, but I think that is the root of the xenophobic attacks that have happened in the past 5 to 10 years in this country, where there's violence and attacks on foreign nationals that come from other African countries, because we don't know anything about the rest of the continent. And we have a youth that is being manipulated because there is lack of knowledge about the real history of our continent. And so I luckily enough, the universe allowed for me to be invited into a youth conference in Congo in 2012. And I came back thinking to myself, okay, again, how do I use my educational space that I'm in to make sure that I'm pushing this agenda of young people being curious and understanding more about their country? So I said to my classmate, to um, my students at the time, I said to them, you live in a community where there are Africans from all over this continent who are either working at salons, fixing your shoes, doing all sorts of work. So I want you to go to each one of them, and I want you to document their story of how they got to this country. I want you to write down what they're telling you, take a photo with them. And it was the grade 12 class, the matric class, and they came back and did a presentation in front of the whole school. And I had boys again, sobbing, talking about, this person came to this country with only 10 rands in their pocket. They had nothing, and they've been working hard since then. And I've never thought to understand their story. I just listen to what people are saying, that foreigners are taking our jobs and so on. And I've never really understood their journey and them coming in here. So from there on, I've just been passionate about making sure that we are grooming a nation of young people that are excited about being African. And for them to be excited about African, they need to know the real history of Africa that did not start with colonization, that started way before that, where we were powerful and we were strong and we had knowledge and we had content that is currently being used today. So I needed them to know that kind of Africa, right? So I thought to myself, how do I combine the healing work that I want to do and the passion for this continent and the need for knowledge for this continent, as well as addressing the needs of each community that I'd be working in? So on those three pillars of finding out what are the needs of the community, making sure that we are grooming a young generation that understands the history and is passionate about working and solving the problems of this continent, but at the same time, young people that claim themselves to be agents of positive change in their own communities because they are a healing nation, and they work throughout their emotions. So African Consciousness Learning Center was built around that. And it's for now, it's a space where young people can come in and say, I'm not happy about what's happening in my community. Let's have a conversation about it, right? And we say to ourselves, all right, so who else do we bring into this conversation? Let's bring in the mothers who work in the garden. Let's bring in the fathers who are helpful with some of the problems we have in our communities and so on. Let's sit down as a community and let's look at each other's eyes and say, how do we do things differently, right? So it's in its initial stages, and that's the work that's currently happening now. But my hope is that it can develop into a proper center where it's a safe space for, obviously, for young people, but also for adults to come in and say, how do we heal together? How do we move forward? And as adults, how do we come into that space not as experts of life, but as learners as well, who are saying, lead us, young people, tell us what can we do, because obviously we are failing, and obviously we're not doing things the way it was supposed to be done. So it's an exciting project for me because it combines everything that I'm passionate about, and I'm hoping that in the next 5 years, then it can work. It's work that can spread into the continent, and have a center in each continent, and have those young people in those centers all communicating together, pushing the African agenda and saying we are not excited anymore about just being Harvard students, but we want to make sure that I'm going to be as successful coming from the University of South Africa and solving the issues of this continent as well. Because we are currently losing a lot of our young people to, American or Western universities, which I think is not a problem. But I think where it becomes a problem, and where I think we are naive, is to think just because Zonke got a scholarship to go study in Harvard, she's gonna want to come back and continue being an African and solving the problems. Of course, she's not gonna want to come back, because there's nothing at the moment. Young people feel like there's nothing this continent can offer them, and to some extent they're right. So how do we start changing that? How do we say, even though they may go and study abroad, we know for a fact they can come back, because this continent can offer them so much more than what an American university can, which is more than just opportunity, but identity and groundedness and rootedness as well in their own identity.
Mm. It's amazing work you're doing, and yeah, I love hearing your stories as well. When you go into these real experiences, it's really moving. And yeah, I guess I just want to ask you this question to wrap up, because I'm looking at the time. But what is the vision of the future that fuels you in your work?
Wow. Sure. I think a lot of the times when we want to talk about the future, and how it looks like, um, a part of us wants to go big. We want to talk about how the economy is working, and how infrastructure is working for its people, and so on. And I think that's important as well. All of that big stuff I think is important. But for me, I've come to realize that, and again, it's in my journey of discovering this continent and the beauty of it. It's understanding that at the core of our being as Africans is our humanity, right? And and there's a famous saying in this continent that says "Umntu ngumntu ngabantu," which means a person is a person through another person. So I cannot exist without you, right? And at the center of that is the family structure, whatever that family structure is, right? Is the family structure, which is the most powerful structure that we see in this continent, right? And we used to believe that that family structure can conquer anything. If Zonke tomorrow is facing depression, the family structure holds Zonke tight, and the family structure says we're here for you. The family structure says let's work through this together, you know. And so you break that, nothing else can hold, because who am I without that family structure? So for me, a future I see in Africa is strong families who are able to hold each other, who are able to hold young people at the center and say, um, for an example, we used to have fires, we used to sit around the fire and the grandparents would tell stories. So it's images like that to me that sit at the back of my head, and I say, imagine with all the mental health problems we are facing now, where young people just want to be held. Young people just want to be embraced and told, you are okay, you are enough, and I'm here for you. Imagine that. Now, you ask any of those young people going through those mental health problems and those difficulties in their journeys, and you ask them, when was the last time you were held and loved? and embraced, right? And we start there. So the future I see for me that gets me all tingled up and emotional is knowing that we would grow and build a generation that is very strong and very grounded in who they are because they come from very strong families. The rest of the stuff, politics, economy, and all of the stuff, that would come easy. That's skills that can be taught within a night. You read a book and you understand something about economics, you know. But how good are you as a politician if you're not grounded, if you're not loved, if you're not embraced? So for me, that's give me that any day and take away everything else.
Thank you. I would happily talk to you for hours, but I promised myself these interviews would not go beyond half an hour. So thank you so much. Is there anything else you'd like to say for the
Yeah, I mean, I would like to thank you for these conversations. I think every time I'm involved in conversations like these ones, it's a reminder to me. It sort of ignites that work to me. You know, sometimes you work and you hope that something changes and something, you know, shifts. But it's through conversations like these ones where you step back and you're like, oh, so that's the work I'm doing. So that's what's going on here. So I really want to thank you for taking me into that space of really appreciating um what I'm doing, because we don't do that often. You know, we just work and hope that somewhere something shifts. But it's conversations like these that make me believe that um I mean, someone gave up a whole 40 minutes to listen to me. So something must be important there. So thank you so much for giving me this platform and be able to proudly stand as an African and say we do have a bright future. It might not look like it right now, but watch out for the next generation.